Sign languages are a group of languages around the world that do not have a connection via a language family. Rather, they share a common feature in that they are languages that do not use vocal cords or phonemes, but instead use shapes and movements of the body to communicate ideas. William Stokoe demonstrated that these sets of languages are all complete and natural languages, as much as spoken languages are, with comprehensive grammar systems. Importantly, there's a unique sociolinguistic aspect to sign languages. Sign languages arose as a way for those who cannot understand spoken language to communicate, particularly people who are deaf. In many ways, sign languages are representative of and belong to the deaf community. It's also important to note the deaf community does not only consist of those who are deaf. Many in the deaf community have joined not because of deafness, but because of other significant hearing or speaking related disorders. Globally, the community remains a diverse group that struggles with a number of social issues, including lack of representation, lack of accommodation for hearing needs, and lack of adequate study on the importance of their language, and particularly the sociolinguistics of sign languages, which this study hopes to rectify. I assert that due to the common issues facing the deaf community, the group can be treated as a distinct culture, independent of national, geographical, and ethnic distinctions, and they can be analyzed based on their internal and external cultural interactions independent of other factors. In 1973, James Woodward Jr. wrote a paper attempting to bring the deaf community to the interest of sociologists and pointed out some very significant details about the social issues pertaining to the deaf community. Referencing Stokoe, he showed that deaf culture is primarily transmitted through deaf schools, and deaf schools have historically not been run by deaf people. This has significant effects on the community. For instance, there's a distinct diglossia in speakers of American Sign Languages, or ASL. The diglossia at the time of this paper had a high variety and a low variety. The low variety is what you might call pure ASL, the grammatically natural form of the language, and the high variety is something called Manual Sign English, or MSE. And it could be considered ASL, but it's actually a combination of ASL and English. MSE uses ASL signs for some words, but uses English grammar and attempts to replicate English grammatical phonemes using fingerspelling. This is not the only occasion when ASL tries to emulate spoken language. As Robert Battinson's 1978 publication Lexical Borrowing in American Sign Language demonstrates, sometimes fingerspelling is used to communicate entire words, and that process can cause new words to be imported into the ASL lexicon from English as signs in ASL. So there's a bit of a question about how much language variation is due to the internal features of ASL or other sign languages, and how much comes from contact with spoken languages. Broadly speaking, this question is about how much autonomy the larger deaf community has over their own culture. Many of the anecdotes I cited here are a bit outdated, and presumably the civil rights movement has helped give more rights and freedoms to the community. Woodward's paper demonstrated that there are several factors which cause a speaker of ASL to speak more in the low ASL variety, i.e., the more grammatically correct version, or not grammatically correct, but grammatically natural. And one of these factors was plus college education. As college has become more available around the world, it's probably helping give tools to the deaf community to take control of their own languages. There have been many examples of innovations being made in the community that have spread to the global deaf community, even across different sign languages or dialects of a sign language. For instance, this is the sign for coronavirus, which has only become a word recently. There are already dialectal variations, such as this with the palm facing forward and this with the palm facing down. As far as I researched, this sign began in Auslan, the Australian sign language in Australia, and is now used around the world in various sign languages, including ASL. I decided to conduct a poll asking speakers of sign languages where new words come from in their languages. In asking what their top 3 ways to communicate new concepts in their language was, the largest part of them, 72%, reported fingerspelling, i.e., borrowing a term from a spoken language, in order to communicate this new concept. However, this does not mean that this is how words are permanently entering the lexicon. When I asked only members of the deaf community in the study where new words enter their languages from, 75% of the people surveyed reported that most new signs come from the deaf community itself, either through iconicity, which is a much larger thing in sign languages than it is in spoken languages, or from deaf-specific symbols, such as signs in other languages. Although some of this data is not necessarily clear, this does give hope that the deaf community is able to sustain the growth of their own languages on their own terms, contributing to their culture overall.